11:47 p.m., May 14, 2026. 4 Neptune anti-ship missiles leave their launch rails somewhere in the darkness of southern Ukraine. Their targets are 287 kilometers away. In exactly 4 hours, Russia's most critical logistics artery in the occupied south will stop breathing entirely. Mariupol port hadn't seen Ukrainian missiles since the early months of the full-scale invasion. That was by Russian design. After annexing the city in 2022, Russian military planners had reinforced Mariupol as a rear logistics hub, calculating that its distance from Ukrainian-controlled territory put it beyond the practical strike envelope of anything Ukraine could field, without risking escalation or burning through scarce precision munitions. For nearly 3 years, that calculation held. Convoys moved freely, ships berthed without incident, rail junctions transferred cargo from sea to road without interruption. The port ran on the machinery of occupation logistics, and Russian commanders in Zaporizhzhia slept soundly, knowing their southern supply chain was safe. They were wrong by exactly 1 Neptune salvo. I'm your host at War Vector, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Tonight we're breaking down one of the most precisely engineered strike operations of the 2026 campaign. An attack that didn't just destroy infrastructure, it rewrote Russian logistics doctrine for the entire southern theater in a single night. What you're about to hear is the full tactical picture, the intelligence work that made it possible, the engineering behind the strike sequence, the moment Russian Pantsir crews realized they'd been outmaneuvered, and the secondary explosions that were still burning when satellite imagery passed overhead the following morning. Stay with me. To understand why Mariupol port mattered so much, you have to understand Russia's southern supply problem in early 2026. The Zaporizhzhia front had been grinding through a brutal attritional phase since autumn 2025, with Russian forces trying to consolidate positions along a 140-kilometer line stretching from the Dnipro river bend toward Orikhiv. That front consumed materiel at a staggering rate. Artillery shells, fuel, replacement track assemblies for T-72 and T-80 tanks, mortar rounds, small arms ammunition. All of it had to flow south from Russian territory or across the Kerch Strait by sea. The land routes through Donetsk were increasingly contested. Ukrainian HIMARS strikes throughout late 2025 had degraded road infrastructure and made Russian logistics planners nervous about concentrating supply movements along predictable corridors. The sea route through the Azov, terminating at Mariupol, had become the preferred alternative, quieter, less exposed, or so they believed. Which weapon system ended Russia's Mariupol supply route? HIMARS, artillery, or Neptune missiles? Comment below with your answer. Ukrainian General Staff analysts had been watching Mariupol's port infrastructure evolve throughout late 2025 and into 2026. Satellite imagery confirmed a pattern. Russian cargo movements through the port had increased by an estimated 40% between November 2025 and February 2026. The pier-side warehousing footprint had expanded, with 3 new prefabricated storage structures appearing adjacent to the main unloading berths by January 2026. A rail transfer junction, visible on commercial satellite imagery as a dense concentration of rolling stock and intermodal equipment, had been upgraded with additional switch infrastructure, allowing faster transfer of containerized cargo from ship to road or rail. OSINT analysts working with Ukrainian military intelligence had flagged the junction as a priority target as early as December 2025. The targeting package that would eventually destroy this infrastructure took 11 weeks to assemble. Not 11 weeks of watching, 11 weeks of building a precise strike solution that could defeat the air defense systems Russia had positioned to protect its most valuable logistics node in the south. Russia had not left Mariupol undefended. OSINT investigations revealed at least 2 Pantsir S-1 combined gun missile systems, protecting the port and its immediate approaches, positioned to provide overlapping coverage against low-altitude threats. A longer-range S-300 battery covered the broader approach corridor, though its radar geometry made it less effective against sea-skimming missiles approaching from the southwest. Ukrainian targeting analysts understood the Pantsir coverage geometry precisely. The Pantsir S-1 is a formidable short-range system. 1257E6, surface-to-air missiles, radar-guided 30mm cannons, effective against targets out to approximately 20 kilometers and up to 15 kilometers altitude. Against a single incoming missile, or even two, its engagement capacity is substantial. Against a carefully sequenced salvo designed to saturate its engagement timeline, that is a different problem entirely. Stay with me. What unfolds in the next 18 minutes of this story destroys Russia's Azov supply route entirely. The Neptune is Ukraine's indigenous anti-ship missile, derived from the Soviet Kh-35 design, but substantially modernized. It cruises at sea-skimming altitude, as low as 3 to 10 meters above the water surface, which severely compresses radar detection timelines for defending systems. Its guidance combines inertial navigation with active radar terminal homing, making it resistant to jamming. Range in the anti-ship role extends beyond 280 kilometers in the upgraded variants Ukraine deployed in 2025. Warhead weight is 145 kilograms of high explosive, sufficient to cause catastrophic damage to merchant vessels or shore infrastructure. At Mariupol, the Ukrainians were not targeting ships. They were targeting the infrastructure those ships fed. The insight that shaped the entire strike plan was this: the Pantsir S-1 systems defending the port had a finite engagement capacity against simultaneous or near-simultaneous threats. Ukrainian strike planners, working through the geometry of the Pantsir radar coverage and known engagement timelines, concluded that a 4-missile salvo launched in a staggered sequence, the first 2 missiles arriving slightly ahead of the second pair, could predictably consume the Pantsir system's full engagement attention on the lead missiles, leaving the trailing pair with a clear approach to target. It was not a guaranteed outcome, it was a calculated probability. The kind of calculation that separates precision strike planning from hope. How many Neptune missiles did Ukraine fire in the Mariupol port strike? To Distulas, ton 2B4C, 6. Answer coming at the end. The launch platforms were mobile, truck-mounted Neptune coastal defense systems operating from concealed positions. Mobile launch means survivable launch. Ukraine had learned that lesson painfully through years of war. Fixed launch sites are death sentences. The systems moved, they fired, they moved again, before Russian counter-battery radar could build a solution. On the night of May 14th into May 15th, 2026, the launch vehicles had pre-positioned during daylight hours, under cover of tree lines and agricultural structures, roughly 80 to 110 kilometers from the Zaporizhzhia coastline, within range of Mariupol's port infrastructure. The precise launch coordinates had been surveyed weeks earlier. The firing solutions had been loaded, checked, rechecked. By 11 p.m., the crews were in position and waiting. The trigger was confirmation. Ukrainian intelligence, combining satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and likely drone observation from assets operating in the western Azov region, had been monitoring Mariupol port for a specific opportunity. Both Russian supply vessels known to be in the Azov operating cycle had to be simultaneously berthed and actively unloading. A single vessel could be replaced. 2 vessels berthed with cargo, actively moving to the pier-side warehouses, represented a full logistics cycle in progress, a moment when the maximum possible value was concentrated at the target complex. At 11:19 p.m. on May 14th, that confirmation arrived. Satellite pass data, cross-referenced against signals patterns consistent with active crane and vehicle operations at the pier, indicated both vessels were berthed and the rail junction was active. The transfer was underway. Ukrainian strike planners had their window. The launch authorization took 11 minutes to process through command channels. At 11:47 p.m., the first Neptune left its rail. Subscribe to War Vector if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because what happens in the next 4 hours is a masterclass in precision logistics interdiction. The 4 missiles were launched in 2 pairs, separated by a carefully calculated interval. The first pair departed within seconds of each other. The second pair launched approximately 4 minutes later, timed so that the second pair would arrive at the Pantsir engagement envelope roughly 60 to 90 seconds after the first pair had already demanded full engagement attention from the defending systems. Neptune missiles at sea-skimming altitude cover ground at approximately 900 to 950 kilometers per hour. Mariupol port, at the distances involved, represented a flight time of roughly 18 to 22 minutes, depending on precise routing. The missiles were not flying direct paths. They were routed to approach from a bearing that maximized the effectiveness of their sea-skimming profile against the known radar geometry of the S-300 and Pantsir systems. At 12:06 a.m. on May 15, 2026, Russian air defense radar operators at Mariupol detected the first pair of inbound contacts. The signatures were consistent with sea-skimming anti-ship missiles. At that altitude and speed, the detection-to-impact timeline for the Pantsir crews was measured in seconds, not minutes. Both Pantsir S-1 systems activated and engaged. The missiles were small, fast, and hugging the surface. The Pantsir's 57 E-6 missiles, each traveling at up to 1,300 meters per second, are capable of intercepting such targets. But the geometry of a sea-skimming engagement against a crossing or slightly descending target is among the more demanding in the Pantsir engagement catalog. Both missiles in the first pair were intercepted. Ukrainian planners had expected this. In fact, it was the plan. Put yourself in the Pantsir crew's position for a moment. 2 contacts destroyed, radar still scanning, system transitioning from engagement mode, and then the second pair arrives. The Pantsir systems had burned through a significant portion of their ready missile load on the first pair. Reloading takes time. Transition back to full ready status takes time. The Ukrainian strike planners had designed the second pair's arrival to fall inside that window. At 12:09 a.m., the third Neptune struck the primary munitions storage warehouse on the northern pier complex. The fourth struck the rail transfer junction approximately 8 seconds later. The warhead detonations were severe. 145 kilograms of high explosive delivered to a structure containing artillery shells, propellant charges, and vehicle fuel initiates a cascade that goes far beyond the initial blast. The secondary explosions began immediately and continued for 40 minutes. Intercepts of Russian military communications in the hours following the strike, fragments shared with Ukrainian media outlets, indicated sustained confusion and panic among port security and logistics personnel, attempting to account for personnel and assess damage, while secondary detonations continued to occur unpredictably. Here's something that still doesn't sit right when you look back at the Russian defense posture around Mariupol port in the weeks before the strike. The Pantsir coverage was adequate for the threat, as Russian planners had modeled it. What they had not modeled, or had modeled incorrectly, was a salvo specifically engineered to defeat their defense by design. Most people assume that air defense systems around a high-value logistics node will be robust enough to stop a small missile salvo. The evidence from Mariupol says otherwise. What strikes us at War Vector about this operation is what it reveals about how Ukrainian strike planning has matured. This was not an opportunistic strike. It was not a target of convenience. The 11-week preparation timeline, the precise salvo geometry, the deliberate use of the first missile pair as a Pantsir exhaustion mechanism. This is the kind of operational sophistication that normally takes military establishments decades to develop. Ukraine built it under fire, in real time, against a peer-level adversary. That is worth pausing on. The satellite imagery obtained the morning of May 15th confirmed the scale of the damage. The primary munitions warehouse was destroyed, the roof had collapsed, and the blast pattern extended across a radius consistent with the secondary detonations reported in communications intercepts. The rail transfer junction showed severe structural damage to the transfer gantry and associated track infrastructure. Of the 2 Russian supply vessels that had been berthed at the time of the strike, one had departed under emergency power and was later observed operating with a visible list, combat footage verification shows imagery consistent with a vessel that had sustained hull damage from blast overpressure or debris impact during the secondary explosions. The second vessel had departed the berth, but was not immediately tracked beyond the port immediate area. The Azov resupply route through Mariupol was suspended. Russian logistics commanders in the southern theater faced an immediate problem. The cargo that had been in transit through Mariupol had to go somewhere. The land routes through Donetsk were the only alternative. Those routes were longer, more fuel-intensive, more exposed to Ukrainian HIMARS and drone interdiction, and already operating close to their practical capacity. Ukrainian General Staff reports in the weeks following the Mariupol strike documented a measurable increase in Russian logistics vehicle movement along the Donetsk highway network, and a corresponding increase in Ukrainian strikes against those columns, using HIMARS and FPV drones, as Russian commanders tried to compensate. If you believe that tactics win wars, type war vector in the comments. The cost-exchange ratio of the Mariupol strike is worth examining in precise terms. 4 Neptune missiles represent a significant munitions expenditure. These are not cheap weapons. Ukrainian sources estimate the full cost of the strike package, including logistics and launch operation, in the range of several $million. Against that cost, the strike achieved the destruction of a high-value logistics infrastructure complex, likely damage to 1 or 2 supply vessels, the suspension of a major Russian supply route for weeks, and the forced rerouting of Russian logistics through a more vulnerable and expensive overland network. Ukrainian strike planners, in post-operation assessments shared through official channels, characterized it as the most cost-efficient Neptune deployment of the 2026 Southern campaign. That assessment looks well-grounded. Here is the take that will probably generate argument in the comments. Russia's decision to concentrate so much logistics throughput through Mariupol port, rather than dispersing it across multiple smaller nodes, was not a resource constraint. It was an arrogance constraint. Russian commanders in the south had assessed that Mariupol's distance placed it beyond practical Ukrainian strike range. They made that assessment, and then did not revise it as Ukrainian strike capability continued to evolve throughout 2025. Mariupol was not struck because Russia lacked the resources to disperse its logistics infrastructure. It was struck successfully because Russian planners assumed the rules they had written in 2022 still applied in 2026. They did not, and hundreds of tons of Russian military cargo burned on the Azov waterfront as a consequence. There is a particular piece of the strike timeline that stayed with me when I worked through the Ukrainian targeting chronology. The 11 minutes between confirmation of both vessels berthed and the launch authorization. 11 minutes to make the call. That is not a long time for a decision that would reshape the Russian logistics picture in the south for weeks. Somewhere in a Ukrainian command facility, on the night of May 14th, someone looked at satellite confirmation imagery, looked at the weather window, looked at the readiness reports from the mobile launch teams, and said, yes, 11 minutes. That kind of institutional confidence, the ability to compress decision timelines while maintaining operational precision, does not happen by accident. It is built through years of training, through doctrine development, through combat experience accumulated at enormous cost. Ukraine paid for that capability in blood, across 4 years of full-scale war. The Mariupol strike was part of that payment coming due. What would NATO have done differently with the same intelligence picture and the same target? Comment your tactical analysis below. The weeks following the Mariupol strike revealed additional dimensions of the damage. Ukrainian intelligence sources, in assessments shared with Western partners, reported that the Russian Military Logistics Directorate for the Southern Theater had convened an emergency review of port security protocols across all Azov facilities, not just Mariupol. The Kerch Strait crossing, already under pressure from Ukrainian drone operations throughout 2025, received additional air defense assets diverted from other priorities. Russian cargo movement through the Azov was restructured, with smaller vessel movements replacing the concentrated 2-ship cycles that had made the May 14th strike package so valuable. In trying to reduce their vulnerability to a repeat strike, Russian logistics planners were forced to accept lower throughput efficiency and higher operating costs. The Neptune strike was producing effects well beyond its immediate blast radius. Ukrainian drone operators working the Donetsk highway network in the weeks after the Mariupol strike found their targeting picture enriched by the rerouted Russian logistics traffic. FPV drone units, operating $500 to $800 munitions against vehicle columns worth millions, documented strikes against Russian fuel tankers and ammunition trucks attempting to compensate for the Mariupol shortfall. The cost-exchange ratio that had made the Mariupol Neptune strike efficient was replicated at smaller scale daily along the overland routes, as Russian logistics adaptation created new vulnerabilities faster than they could close them. This is the compounding logic of precision logistics interdiction. The first strike forces adaptations that create second-order vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities get exploited in turn. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine finds new ways to fight. The Mariupol port operation illustrates this clearly. The innovation was not in the Neptune missile itself, which is a mature design. The innovation was in the salvo geometry, deliberately sacrificing the first pair to exhaust Pantsir engagement capacity so the second pair could reach target. That tactical insight, applied to an existing weapon system at a target that Russian planners had considered safe, produced an outsized strategic result. This is the pattern that has defined Ukrainian military adaptation throughout the full-scale war, finding non-obvious applications for available means against the gaps in adversary thinking. The Pantsir S-1 crews who engaged and successfully intercepted the first missile pair were doing their jobs correctly, by every standard of their training and doctrine. The failure was not at the crew level, it was architectural, a point defense system positioned to defeat individual or small number threats, not a salvo engineered to saturate its engagement capacity by design. Russian air defense doctrine, developed primarily against NATO air-launched threats with different profiles and delivery geometries, was confronted with a specifically tailored Ukrainian strike sequence and found inadequate for that specific challenge. The lesson for any military force defending high-value fixed infrastructure against a sophisticated adversary is direct. Point defense alone is insufficient when the adversary has studied your defense geometry and designed their attack around its capacity limits. Will Russia find a way to fully restore the Azov resupply route in 2026? Comment yes or no. We read every response. The Mariupol port strike also demonstrated how Ukrainian signals intelligence and satellite imagery integration for time-sensitive targeting has matured. The trigger condition, simultaneous berthing of both supply vessels with active offloading confirmed, required real-time integration of multiple intelligence streams into an actionable decision within a narrow time window. The vessels were not always berthed simultaneously. Ukrainian targeting analysts had been monitoring the berthing cycle for weeks, building a pattern that allowed them to anticipate when the trigger condition might occur, and ensuring the launch assets were pre-positioned and ready. When confirmation came, the 11-minute decision cycle was possible because every other preparation had already been completed. The intelligence preparation, the weeks of patient watching and positioning, was what made the rapid decision possible when the moment arrived. The 3 pier-side storage warehouses that formed part of the original targeting package were not all struck directly. The Neptune warheads hit the munitions warehouse and the rail junction, but the secondary explosions from the munitions warehouse created a pressure and fragmentation environment that damaged the adjacent storage structures as well. Satellite imagery confirmed structural damage to at least one of the warehouses adjacent to the primary strike point, damage that reflected the force of secondary detonations from the initial warhead impact rather than the warhead itself. This is the cascading logic of striking munitions storage. The first explosion creates subsequent explosions that extend damage beyond the immediate impact point. Ukrainian targeting analysts understood this and incorporated it into their damage assessment predictions. Their predictions were accurate. For the Russian commanders managing the Zaporizhzhia front in the weeks following the Mariupol strike, the operational picture became measurably harder. Logistics is not a background condition of warfare. It is a fundamental determinant of what is operationally possible. When artillery shell throughput declines, artillery units begin rationing. When fuel throughput declines, vehicle operational tempo decreases. When replacement parts cannot move reliably, maintenance backlogs grow. The cumulative effect of sustained logistics pressure is attrition of operational capacity that does not show up immediately in frontline vehicle counts or casualty figures, but manifests over weeks in reduced Russian offensive initiative and degraded defensive resilience. Ukrainian forces on the Zaporizhzhia front reported in the weeks following the strike that Russian artillery activity in their sector decreased measurably, consistent with the disrupted supply picture. Real tactics, real consequences. War vector. The mobile launch platforms that fired the May 14th salvo had dispersed and relocated within 90 minutes of the final launch. By the time Russian radar systems had processed the launch detection signatures and Russian military command had authorized any response, the launch vehicles were in new positions that bore no predictable relationship to where they had fired from. This survivability calculus is central to Ukraine's strike campaign architecture. The ability to strike and survive to strike again is what has allowed Ukrainian precision fires to maintain sustained pressure on Russian rear infrastructure, rather than delivering a single blow and exhausting the capability. Russian counter-battery and counter-strike operations have consistently faced this challenge. A mobile firing system that moves immediately after launch denies the defender the retaliatory strike opportunity that a fixed site would provide. The satellite imagery from the morning of May 15, 2026, the imagery that confirmed the scope of what the Neptune strike had achieved, was circulating within Ukrainian military intelligence channels before Russian commanders had fully assessed the damage themselves. The speed of Ukrainian battle damage assessment, enabled by commercial satellite access, and trained OSINT analytical capacity, gave Ukrainian planners a picture of the strike outcome faster than their adversary could compile the same information through their own channels. This information advantage, seeing what happened and drawing operational conclusions before the adversary has processed the same events, is a recurring feature of how Ukraine has fought the 2026 campaign. Here's what nobody expected when this strike was in the planning phase. The most significant long-term consequence of the Mariupol port operation may not be the immediate logistics disruption, but the behavioral change it forced on Russian naval logistics planning throughout the Azov. After May 15th, Russian supply vessels in the Azov did not return to the pre-strike pattern of extended port stays with simultaneous multi-vessel berthing. They moved faster, stayed shorter, reduced the cargo throughput per port visit, and by doing so, reduced the overall efficiency of the sea supply route, even without additional Ukrainian strikes. A single successful strike had reshaped adversary behavior across the entire theater, and that behavioral change degraded Russian logistics capacity every day it persisted, at zero additional cost to Ukraine. That is the strategic multiplier effect of a precision strike well executed. The broader operational lesson of the Mariupol port strike for the 2026 campaign is about range assumptions. Throughout the war, Russian planners have made periodic assessments of what Ukraine can and cannot reach, and have positioned high-value assets behind those assumed boundaries. The Neptune strike on Mariupol demonstrated once again, as Ukrainian strikes on Crimea, the Kerch Bridge, and Black Sea Fleet assets had demonstrated before it, that those range assumptions are unstable. Ukrainian strike capability has grown steadily. The range envelope of precision munitions has extended, and the targeting methodology has become more sophisticated. Any Russian asset positioned on the assumption that it is beyond Ukrainian reach is positioned on a foundation that has proven repeatedly to be wrong. The Azov Sea is quiet tonight. The port of Mariupol, from a distance and to an untrained eye, looks much as it has looked throughout the occupation. Cranes, warehouses, a waterfront adapted to the military logistics of an occupying force. But the infrastructure burned on May 15th has not been fully replaced. Satellite imagery in the weeks following the strike confirmed ongoing reconstruction activity at the munitions warehouse site and the rail junction. But the pace of reconstruction was constrained by the same logistics challenges the strike had created: materiel and labor, competing for priority in a system already under pressure. The Russian military's Azov logistics network continued to function, but it functioned at reduced efficiency and with a new awareness of vulnerability that it had not carried before. That awareness is itself an achievement. Every Russian logistics planner who now models a route through Mariupol and includes in that model a probability of Ukrainian Neptune strike is spending cognitive and resource capacity on survivability measures that would not otherwise be necessary. That is a form of friction, persistent, cumulative, costly, imposed on the adversary at the cost of 4 missiles. Now for the quiz answer. The question was, how many Neptune missiles did Ukraine fire in the Mariupol port strike? The answer is B, 4. Ukraine launched 4 Neptune missiles in 2 pairs, separated by approximately 4 minutes. The first pair was intentionally used to exhaust Pantsir S-1 engagement capacity at the port, drawing both defending systems into active engagement and depleting their ready missile load. The second pair, launched with precise timing, calculated to arrive within the Pantsir system's reload and transition window, struck the primary munitions warehouse and the rail transfer junction with both warheads reaching target. This salvo geometry, deliberately sacrificing the first pair as a defense saturation mechanism, was the tactical insight that made the entire operation possible. 2 missiles expended to defeat the defense, 2 missiles expended to destroy the target. The mathematics of precision were exact. Was the decision to use the first missile pair as a deliberate Pantsir exhaustion mechanism the right tactical choice, given the cost of the missiles sacrificed? Reasonable analysts can disagree. The alternative, launching all 4 simultaneously to maximize saturation, might have achieved similar or better results against the Pantsir coverage, but would have provided less predictable separation between the lead and trailing missiles. The staggered pair approach provided more controlled timing of the Pantsir engagement demand and more predictable terminal geometry for the striking pair. Ukrainian planners chose the more controlled approach. The outcome validates the choice, though outcomes are not always the only measure of tactical judgment. Could Russian forces have prevented the Mariupol port strike with different air defense positioning? The honest answer is, probably not, with the systems available in theater, deployed against a salvo specifically engineered to defeat point defense. A layered defense with additional assets, longer-range radar coverage, additional Pantsir systems, with overlapping engagement geometry, or active naval patrol capability in the western Azov, providing earlier warning, might have complicated the strike. But the fundamental vulnerability was not the number of Pantsir systems. It was the architectural assumption that point defense alone was sufficient against a sophisticated adversary studying that defense. What would you have done differently in the Ukrainian strike planning process? More missiles in the salvo? A different approach geometry? Simultaneous attack on the air defense positions before the port strike? The comments section is where that analysis happens. Subscribe to War Vector, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Azov waterfront is quieter now than it was before May 15th. The port operates, cautiously, under a new understanding of its own vulnerability. The wrecked warehouses and twisted steel of the rail junction sit as permanent reminders of what Ukrainian precision strike capability can reach when its planners have done their work thoroughly and its crews have done their jobs with precision. Modern warfare does not forgive the assumption of safety. It does not respect distance the way it once did. It punishes the confident miscalculation of adversary reach, with consequences measured in fire and tonnage and weeks of broken supply chains. Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. War Vector. Stay vigilant.